Once again, welcome to the webinar on calving trait improvements planned for the genetic evaluations. My name is Amy Taplata Church with Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, and am pleased on behalf of the Council and USDA AGIL, the Animal Genomics Improvement Laboratory, to host this webinar today. I'm going to turn it over to Ezequiel Nicolazzi, first present. He is the technical director at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. And after Ezequiel's brief presentation, John Cole from USDA AGIL will share his insights and the changes that we expect this month. Our purpose today is to really open it up for questions from you. The presentations will be brief, and after the two presentations, panel dialogue with our two presenters, Ezequiel and John, joined by Tom Lawler and Sophie Eglin. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Ezequiel Nicolazzi.
Thank you, Amy. So as Amy was saying, this is the first of two short presentations about the new phenotypic base for calving traits. First of all, a few housekeeping communications. The first one is about actually the communications of this change. There has been a number of articles that have been written in order to spread the news about not only what happened in April, but what will happen in August, because the change that we will see in calving traits that will be seen in the PTAs of calving traits will be noticeable. And that's this webinar is a part of that communication effort. Also, CDCB has a monthly newsletter called the CDCB Connection. If you are not subscribed and you're willing to receive this newsletter, please send an email to Cindy Ferrier. You see her email there in the slide. And most importantly, if you are interested in older issues of this newsletter, you can see the link on screen. In our website, there's a menu that is called What's News, and then there's a sub-menu for this newsletter. Last but not least, all questions are welcomed. Please do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat section. After, as Amy was saying, after these presentations, John and myself will be joined by Tom Lawler from Holstein USA and Sophie Eglin from NAB to address them. But now, the main topic, which is what happened to Calvinese and what will happen to Calvinese. First of all, I will deal with two small topics that are important to understand what will happen and what has happened in Calvinese. So, the brief history of Calving trait genetic evaluation is displayed here. So traditionally, the phenotypic records for calving traits have been collected by NAB members, and later on, the data submission itself was transitioned to the DHI system. USDA used those records to produce the first calving trait evaluation back in 2002, I guess, and in 2003, it was included in the Net Merit Index. As you probably know, CDCB took charge of the calculation and publication of all the US dairy industry evaluations. And of course, this includes calving traits, with the only exception of the traditional type traits for Holstein. But before we get into what led to the change in that will be introduced in August, it's important to understand how, or at least in a snapshot of how calving trait evaluations are obtained, and because they are a little bit different from all the other traits. So the traditional evaluations are a sire-maternal grand-sire model, which means essentially that only males are evaluated. And then, of course, with the introduction of genomics, then they are extended to all animals. But the evaluations themselves are a combination of two scales, differently from the other traits. So on one side, we have the underlying scale. So if you hear me or John discussing about underlying scale, that means the genetic base, essentially, is a genetic scale. and the public usually doesn't see this. We send those evaluations to the international evaluations, but the general public doesn't see those values themselves, because they are later on converted into an observed scale, which uses the phenotypic base. And these are the values that the general public sees as a PTA in our reports. So those two components are really important here, because this was essentially what was introduced as a change, as the main change in April 2020. So as you probably know, all the PTAs, all the evaluations that are shared internationally are validated every 2 years. And Calving traits in the last nearly 10 years have showed some sort of trend issue, which essentially means that the model is not entirely accounting for something that, of course, we didn't know what it was. So that created an under or overestimation of genetic merit of young versus old animals. So over the years, there have been multiple attempts to address this, changes in the model, changes in the editing criteria, changes in how the data was handled, et cetera, but none of them had the desired effect on addressing the issue on all the traits, on all the Calving traits. So last year, CDCB started collaborating with Dr. Bifani from Italy, that in collaboration with USDA and North Carolina State University, reviewed the Calving trait evaluation as a whole and introduced some changes to the model, to the genetic part. So after these introductions, the Calving traits successfully validated the international trends, both across lactation and across time, which was something extremely desired. And of course, that's something that we were not accounting for was finally discovered. So what were the changes that were applied in the genetic component, in the first part of these Calving trait evaluations in April? There were essentially two main changes to the evaluation. The first one was on the data itself. There was the exclusion of all the herds that were reporting only easy calvings, and there was some confusion about this, and we received a number of concerns from producers, thinking that their data was being excluded simply because they were selecting for these or taking care on the management side on this. This exclusion is only for herds that always have reported easy calving, so they don't have any kind of variability on the data across time. So it was not affecting most of them actually. The second change was on the merging of the extreme categories. This was because calving scores of 4 and 5 usually have lower frequency, so merging them made a lot of sense. On the genetic side, however, there were the main changes being applied. There were, of course, new genetic parameters, but other than the genetic-based change that occurred in April for all the traits, the main change on the genetic model was the introduction of this interaction of effects of parity, sex, and birth year of sire and maternal grandsire. And this, as you can see from the graph, accounts for this different sex ratio that happened in the last nearly 10, 15 years, especially for animals in first lactation. As you can see there, the percentage of female is higher than the percentage in male. And that was the main driver of that's something that I was telling you about that was not entirely being accounted for, although the model itself accounted for sex. So what happened in April? That's probably the main question here. As you can see, as I was saying, the two components here interact. So we calculate the evaluation in an observed scale, and then we translate that into a phenotypic scale, an observed scale. And since 2005, the US dairy industry decided as a whole to keep the phenotypic base constant, this well-known 8% that everybody knows. The objective of this was fairly simple, and it was a really good idea, which was essentially try to avoid the confounding effect between phenotypic progress and genetic progress. Essentially, the PTAs should reflect only the genetics part of the progress. So, of course, this led to a number of side effects, which is the practice of this truncation selection, that any bull above 8% SCE was either discarded or was not preferred. The problem here in April 2020, and that was what led to essentially this webinar, is that the changes in the genetic model plus the new genetic base led a large part of the bull population to be over that 8% threshold. So we got a number of concerns about this is not what I see in my farm. And of course, this leads to questioning the validity of the evaluation itself. I just want to reassure that the genetic evaluation itself is in better shape than it has been for years. Of course, the update on the phenotypic base needs to be addressed, and that's what we are here for, and John will discuss this thoroughly. So the conclusions, and this is of course a partial conclusion because the rest of the conclusion will come up after John's presentation, is that the good news is that this proves that industry cooperation made in a swift mode is extremely effective. This was a bottom-up effect. The farmers were the first one in reporting this whole difference, and a number of committees and associations and collaborators of CDCB immediately reported and took action. And USDA did all the research in a very fast way in order to address the situation immediately. And usually these changes, especially because they affect the merit, take longer than 4 months. So that is part of the great news of this event. The second one is, I want to repeat myself that the genetic evaluation of Calving trait is sound, is actually much more sound now than in previous year. The upcoming change will be only addressing now how we express the trait to reflect essentially what producers see in their farms or what stats see in their bulls. And what it means is that we are sort of victims of our own success, because this is caused by the big improvements in genetics and management, and John will talk about that in a moment. For the future, both genetic and phenotypic bases will be updated at each genetic base change. Right now, we are running on a 5-year schedule of genetic base update. There are discussions of making that more frequent, but for now, every 5 years, when the genetic base will change, the phenotypic base will also change for Calving traits. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I will leave the floor to John Cole that will address what will happen in August with these traits. So John, the floor is yours. Okay, let's stop the share.
All right, thank you, Ezequiel. I will have slides up here in just a second. All right, so I'd like to thank Ezequiel for doing a great job of setting the stage. And when I look at the list of participants, I see many friends and many colleagues, and it's overwhelming how many folks want to hear about what we've done here to improve the genetic evaluations for calving traits in the US. So if I can get all this stuff out of the way, I will try to walk through what you're going to see happen in August. And so obviously this follows on. Ezequiel set the stage and explained kind of where the disparity came in, this difference between the scale on which the traits are expressed and the incidence of dystocia and stillbirth that folks see on their farm. And in a certain sense, as Ezequiel said, this is a good problem. This happened because we've been successful in our genetic improvement programs, and the farmers all over the country have been very successful at improving the management of their cattle, particularly their pregnant cattle about to go into labor. In particular, this means that problems are caught a lot sooner, and they don't have the opportunity to develop into difficult calvings that can then also have greater risk of dystocia. So right out of the gate, we're not going to hide the upside. So for Holsteins, the sire and daughter calving PTAs they will average 2.2 and 2.7% for the sire and daughter effects respectively. And I want to emphasize what Ezequiel also said. This means that we're going to have to all work together to get rid of this old rule of thumb that a bull over 8 is not acceptable. The reason that needs to go away is because there will be virtually no bulls at all that exceed that threshold on the new base. And I suspect even if there are a few, that 6 months or a year from now, there won't be any available for purchase. We're also changing stillbirth because when we started the stillbirth evaluations in 2006, stillbirth was expressed as the percentage of stillbirths to all cows, regardless of lactations. This is different from the definition of dystocia, which is, or Cavanese, which is difficult births to heifers. We are changing stillbirth to a heifer base as well, so that the interpretation of the stillbirth traits and the Cavanese traits will be the same. And when we look at the change over time, so these are this is a phenotype. Okay, this is not a genetic trend. This is phenotypic trend. We see a substantial reduction in the risk of dystocia over time, and these are Holstein data. And I've already explained why that is. And Ezequiel has explained that we're adjusting the phenotypic base, which we had not changed for many years, to match the observed rates of incidence. So to get straight to things, this table shows you what the new bases will be for the Holstein and Brown Swiss calving traits. The column labeled current base is what the base was, is what the phenotypic base has been for many years. So it's about 8% for both Cavanese and stillbirth and Holsteins, and it's about 5% for the Cavanese traits in Brown Swiss. The changes are going to be largest for Holstein, sire and daughter Cavanese. They'll decrease by almost 6% on average to new averages of 2.2 and 2.7% respectively. The decreases in stillbirth perhaps look like they're a lot smaller than you would have expected, but that's because we're updating the phenotypic base and we're moving from an all-cow base, which has a lower average, to a heifer base, which would have a little bit higher average. So once all of those changes are worked in, you still see a slight decrease in the stillbirth bases. And then there's also a decrease for Brown Swiss, but it's not as large as it is for Holstein, for sire and daughter Cavanese. So what this means now is that in August, the average PTA should match the average rate of stillbirth or average rate of dystocia observed nationally. Obviously, that can differ from herd to herd, but overall, there's going to be a pretty close correspondence, which was not the case in April. Ezequiel said that these bases will be automatically updated. I can promise you that will happen. We've made changes to the programs that do the calculations so that they will automatically update the phenotypic bases when the genetic bases change. So we're finding opportunities to improve the process so that there are fewer cracks for things to fall through. It's also important, the reason we've been very emphatic about changing the rule of thumb about 8% is that the range of the evaluations is going to change. So in the table I'm showing you here, it's similar to the previous table, but it shows the range of evaluations. So the largest and the smallest PTA for each trait and breed combination. And if you look at the first line of data in the table that shows sire Cavanese for Holstein, in April, the range was approximately 17 points, from a low of about 3 to a high of a little over 20. In August, that is going to change dramatically, and the smallest PTA, is going to be about 0.7, and the largest PTA will be 7.6. So if you're still trying to use an old rule of thumb out of habit, it's not going to be useful to you in making a decision because there won't even be a bull over 8 for sire Cavanese. You can see that there will be, a few bulls over 8 for daughter Cavanese, and then the range is going to be a little bit higher for stillbirth. And if you look, I have two figures in the bottom of the slide, and they're showing you the spread. So the figure in the bottom left is sire Cavanese in Holsteins. The gold distribution is the April 2020 values. The purple distribution is the August 2020 values. And you can see that in addition to the mean shifting the whole curve to the left, there's less variation in the traits. So the curve shrinks, it's not as wide. And that's why the range of the evaluations is decreasing. I apologize to you, the table is a little mislabeled. It says 2004 official and 2004 proposed. That's a labeling mistake, and I'll correct that before the slides are posted. The values are correct in the table, but the label's off. And that's because we use our own labeling system internally. And the figure on the bottom right is showing you the change in stillbirths. So you see that there's still a shift to the left. That is, the average PTA will decrease for sire stillbirth. There's not nearly as big a change in the variability, so the curve doesn't decrease in range as dramatically as it does for the sire Cavanese. So, you know, it's only a few point decrease in the range, but that range does shrink down a little bit because there is a little bit less variation. So how is this going to affect individual bulls? So what we've done is we've pulled together some examples of bulls from several different studs. If a bull is in this table, it's not meant to be a criticism of the bull. We just want to have some real world examples to show folks. And as Ezequiel said, the bulls were always ranked correctly. Changing the phenotypic base does not change the ranking of the bulls. Okay, and so here, if we look at sire Cavanese, I'm going to show you the PTAs on both the old base, so the April base, and the new base for August. And what you can see is that in this case, okay, the riveting and Rome, you know, their riveting's ranked a little bit better than Rome, and the difference between the PTAs was 1.8 points. Now, when we go to the new base, the rank is going to stay the same for all of the bulls, but differences between bulls may change. In this case, you can see that riveting still has a more desirable sire Cavanese PTA, but the difference between the two bulls is not as large as it was before. Now, and if you go through and look at each of these, you'll see, if you want to convince yourself, you can see that the bulls do not change rank. So that's good. And so these are brand new numbers. I just got them this morning. And so I think a lot of folks may want to know, how will net merit change? I'm sure folks are also going to want to know, for example, how is TPI going to change? And perhaps Tom Lawler can speak to that when we get to the end of the presentation. So the overall we're seeing 1 point of emphasis come off of calving ability, which is our index that puts the 4 calving traits together. So it's going to decrease from 4.8% emphasis to 3.8% emphasis moving into August. And what you're going to see is that 1% of emphasis that comes off of calving ability is going to get distributed over several other traits that have correlations with net merit. Now, I'm sure that somebody's going to add everything up, and they're going to say, wait a minute, the change in emphasis, if I add it all up, it's 1.1, and you said 1 point is coming off of CA dollars. This is just a consequence of the rounding, because we're only showing things to 1 decimal place. So I am aware of the rounding there. Please don't, please send me emails with questions. Please don't send me angry emails saying I can't do arithmetic, because that's probably true, but I checked it in this case. And so you'll see there's a little bit of emphasis goes back on yield, a little bit goes on the type traits, because there's some association, for example, of body weight composite with the calving traits, and a little bit goes back on livability and fertility. But you're not going to see dramatic changes. There will be some re-ranking of bulls for net merit because we're not changing a single thing in net merit. Because of the correlations among traits, you could see one bull shift up a couple of points, another bull could go down a couple of points. So bulls will not re-rank on the calving traits. They might re-rank a little bit on net merit. This is particularly true for foreign bulls, beg your pardon, because sometimes they have, foreign bulls sometimes have missing traits that we fill in when we're converting, beg your pardon, when we're converting the interbull data, particularly for productive life. Some countries don't report a longevity score. So you might see a little bit bigger changes in net merit for foreign bulls than for domestic bulls. Now, is this problem solved now that we're shifting to these new bases that make calving ease look like it's maybe not a problem? Well, I don't think the problem is solved. The reason we've made these improvements is because a lot of people have spent a lot of time working to reduce the incidence of dystocia and stillbirth. And these are decisions made by individual farmers and individual industry folks. And if we stop paying attention, this problem could increase again. So you still want to watch, particularly because the range of the stillbirth evaluations is not decreasing, and the average is not decreasing as dramatically for those traits as it is for calving ease. You want to watch stillbirth PTAs on your heifers. Now, if you're using an index, such as net merit dollars or TPI, the calving traits should be accounted for already. So that means you don't need to put extra rules on top of the index. So improvement over time, this is a great success story for the industry. It's been a big success because of collective action. In August, we're going to see much lower average PTAs, 2.2 for sire calving ease and 2.7% for daughter calving ease. The range of the calving traits will decrease, particularly for calving ease. So for sire calving ease, most Holstein bulls will range from 1 to 4%. There will be a small number of animals over that 4%, but very few. This means we don't need our old rules of thumb. And we're also changing stillbirth to be on a heifer base so that the interpretation of calving ease and stillbirth PTAs is the same. It's going to be the percentage of difficult births to heifers or the percentage of stillbirths to heifers. You won't have to keep two different traits straight. Ezequiel talked about this. I'm not going to go over it again. This will be in the slides when they get posted. I am obligated to say where my money came from, and I'm happy to join Ezequiel, Sophie, and Tom in answering any questions any of y'all might have about these changes to the calving traits.
Thank you, Ezequiel and John, for those updates. We do have 3 questions so far in the chat. Before we start answering those questions, I would open the floor to Dr. Tom Lawler with Holstein Association USA. As Dr. Cole mentioned, Tom, you might want to introduce or answer any questions about the TPI formula. We'll give Dr. Lawler just a moment to make sure that his mic is unmuted.
There.
That good?
Yes.
Good. Good afternoon. Good to see you. Nice crowd. So yes, we will be changing the TPI formula. We will be changing just the calving trait components. So unlike the slide that John showed, where all the traits were impacted, for the TPI formula, we have 1% on daughters calving ease and 1% on daughter stillbirth. So for a sum of 2%. That will remain at 2%, but we'll split it up a little bit differently. 0.5% on daughter calving ease and 1.5% on daughter stillbirth. And then we're going to adjust the standard deviations appropriately. We have this distributed amongst our board members right now, and just waiting to make sure that everybody's on board and buys in. So we will have the final changes on our website, and we'll send some emails out to various people. But just to repeat, we will be changing the weights on the calving traits, but no other traits. So an example, like the weight on protein will stay exactly the same. If anybody has any further questions, be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Tom. If there are any questions, please type those into the chat. We'll start to answer the questions in the order that they came in, and we will ask our 4 panelists to answer those as they feel appropriate. So again, our panelists are the speakers today, Ezequiel Nicolazzi and John Cole, joined by Dr. Tom Lawler, who we've just heard from, and Dr. Sophie Iglin from National Association of Animal Breeders. The first question is written, could you please clarify, we have reached a great success in calving traits and moving the selection pressure out of it on a new net merit formula.
Well, I will do my best to answer what I believe Roman is asking about. So yes, Roman, we've in the U.S. So speaking for the U.S., we've seen a substantial decrease in the rate of calving difficulty, particularly. So a little bit of the selection emphasis in the index that used to go to the calving traits is going to go, like I showed in a previous slide, it's going to get spread out over some of the yield and type and fitness traits. You know, it doesn't mean that the traits aren't important, but it means that with the lower variation in those traits because of the change in the base, that that it makes sense to well, it's not me saying it makes sense. When you recompute the index, it shifts some of that emphasis because the standard deviations went down. So we will still have selection pressure in net merit for less dystocia and for less stillbirth. So we're not stopping work on these traits. We're just going to dial it back a little bit. I hope that answered your question.
Moving to the second question, what would be the new threshold in sire calving ease for use on heifers?
Maybe I can comment on this one, because this is a question that we got quite frequently, especially from NAB members, from AI companies and the sales reps working for AI companies. So the truthful answer is that we wouldn't recommend using a new threshold. Pretty much all the bulls, like John said, after August will be between that 1% and 4% range for PTA sire calving ease for Holstein. And that is a perfectly acceptable bull, any of those, to be used on both heifers and cows. So we know that some larger farms, international and domestic, like to separate bull groups between cows and heifers. That's another thing that we don't believe is really necessary anymore. So in addition, a threshold or a new threshold is not really something that we recommend. All of these bulls should be perfectly possible to be used, which is a good thing. So both domestically and internationally. And yeah, we understand that it might be something to wrap your mind around because we've done it for so long, but we believe it's a positive thing that all these bulls can now be used.
Thank you, Sophie. The next question, what would the biggest re-rank changes in lifetime net merit be that you have seen in the data thus far?
I think I can reply to that. I have been testing the code for the August evaluation and rerunning essentially April with the new formula. I think that the greatest changes we've seen are, as John was saying in his presentation, in the foreign bulls that have missing data. And I just want to underline that these numbers I will give shouldn't frighten people. Those are extreme cases with animals with a large number of missing traits. So a change in one of the correlated traits in this multiple trait scenario will rock their evaluations. And we've seen, for example, I remember there was one male, but I don't believe that's an AI bull, because probably the pedigree was incomplete and there was a number of missing information. I don't remember even the year, but there was a change of 4.9 points in productive life. That will translate in essentially almost $100 in net merit. But again, those are a handful of animals that have very extreme changes. The great majority of the bulls that you have seen or you're used to see will not have a great change, especially because those are not involved in those animals that don't have the missing, that have a missing trait. So essentially every important animal should stay sort of the same. There will be some re-ranking based on this change in weighting, but not as dramatic as I just said. So there will be some animals that will have dramatic changes, especially probably in brown Swiss, because the foreign population is much more present than in Holstein. But most of them, it shouldn't be as dramatic.
Thank you, Ezequiel. I see several questions around the change in the threshold, as we've traditionally had 8% as a threshold. Before we get to that topic, a follow-up question for Dr. Lawler. When do you believe the board will finalize the TPI changes so that that's publicly available?
Yeah, we have that all decided and written up and distributed. So we should have a final decision by the end of the week, and we'll have something posted and distributed next Monday. So quite soon. And I just wanted to add a little bit more information to the previous question, and that was on changes. And we have, as I said, we've made the changes to TPI, tried them out. And if you look at the top 100 bulls, the average change is less than 1 TPI point. So I think people's reaction when they see the list, whether it be net merit or TPI, but particularly TPI because we just changed only the calving traits. The ranking for these traits have not changed, so subsequently the ranking for TPI will be very stable.
Do any of the panelists have other comments to what's been presented thus far? One other straightforward question: are the new percent of the 4 traits now going to be in the calving ability portion of the lifetime net merit index?
So the economic weights won't change for calving ability at this moment. They will be updated when we update the whole net merit formula. So what will change is just, instead of subtracting the 8 that have been subtracted so far, the new average will be subtracted. So there's no change in the relative weights there.
Right, and I think, Jenny, if you want to double check how those weights break down, if you look at the new changes memo on the CDCB website for August, the formula is there that shows what the breakdown in weights is between the 4 traits for Holsteins and then the 2 traits for brown Swiss. So that information's out there publicly. I guess I can even put it in the chat, can't I? I can paste the link in so that folks can find it easily. And I did see a question, Amy, if it's okay, that I'd like to address, because I see someone asked about you know, we've made so much progress, right? We're making such a big change in this phenotypic base that I want to get their language exactly right. You know, that their point is, are we really going to see as big an improvement as these numbers suggest? And I'm going to say yes, with a condition. The reason we're seeing such a favorable rate of dystocia phenotypically, right? Because the graph I showed was the population average, not the genetic average. It's a combination of making good choices when selecting bulls and having a good management, you know, on individual farms. So if you decide, hey, the problem is solved, so we don't need to worry about it anymore, and maybe folks shift their focus away a little bit from managing their pregnant cows to some other area of the farm, you could see more problems creep up. Genetics is not the only component of this change. So I'm not sure. I'm trying to find the question because I want to see if we answered it to your satisfaction. It was Dan Brady's question, and I just want to make sure, Dan, do you feel like that answered your question?
So Dan, if you have a follow-up, you could type it into the chat.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't.
He just
John,
replied. That's thanks, John.
Okay. All right.
So some of the related questions, one from Felipe, do you think that the lower PTA for calving ease will lead to farmers taking away emphasis from this trait in the future and therefore a subsequent increase in calving problems?
Amy, thank you for bringing that question up, and Felipe, thank you for asking that question. Amy, you asked Tom and I a few minutes ago if we wanted to add anything to what John and Ezequiel said. I think the presentations were fantastic. One thing to just re-emphasize, and it relates to Felipe's question, is that we did discuss this point in the many committee discussions that we've had, and it was a slight concern. You know, lower PTAs, will that take attention away from the calving traits, and will we then see problems creeping up? So this is something that we will closely monitor. That's not only the case for calving ease and stillbirth, but also for correlated traits such as gestation length. So those are all biologically, genetically correlated to each other. But we currently have them in a single trait evaluation. So we just need to watch in the coming years how the calvings and the stillbirth develop with these changes. So I just want to let Felipe and the rest know that this is something that we're very aware of, and that we're going to monitor closely, so we don't, you know, cause a problem for ourselves, because obviously we don't want to undo what we've all of our progress that we've made.
Well, and if I can add to that very briefly, when we made the changes to the programs that do a lot of these calculations, we also, created some additional files that make it easier for us to keep an eye on the trends and keep track of the changes. So.
Other comments from our panelists? Moving through the chat, I see a few questions specific to calving ease in Russia. So some of the specific questions include, are there suggestions for thresholds in other countries, or what might be the difference between the evaluations for US bulls in other countries? I know our panelists can see the chat questions as well. Would you provide some responses to those questions?
I think they're great questions. The reason I'm hesitating is that I'm wondering if we should have both a technical and non-technical answer. I saw a comment about the genetic correlation with other countries. I don't know if Ezequiel or John can comment on that part of it, more the technical way that we address this in evaluations.
Well, what that's referring to, and I think Ezequiel mentioned it in his talk, is that as a result of the improvements that Stefano Bifani made to the calving traits evaluations last year and early this year, one of the benefits of that is that the correlations of U.S. calving ease traits and stillbirth PTAs with other countries has increased. And so that what that means is that when we predict the PTA for a bull in the U.S. who has daughters in the U.S., and say PTAs are predicted for a bull who has daughters in Russia, those evaluations will be more similar to each other. And that maybe comes back to some of Roman's questions about, can you safely use these lower PTAs now on Russian cows, which they may not be purebred and they may be a little bit smaller. I would say to that, it's difficult to give specific advice, but if you're, I would say use an index that includes the calving information and keep an eye on the PTAs for stillbirth so that you don't put a bull with some higher stillbirth on a heifer.
Right, and I would add, Roman, that if there are any particular herds, specific herds that you are seeing more calving issues with, please reach out to your colleagues or your genetic consultants that you work with, or even us. I'd love to work with you to look into those issues, but those could be herd and cow related, but there are many, as you know, probably mating programs out there and experts out there that can help you select the best bulls for that. But the bulls should be safe, the US bulls should be safe to use. It might just be, the specific herd that we need to look at to see how we can best use them.
Next, we have a question from Brad Hines. What happens to some of the old bulls that were very high for calving ease, like Juniper Rote Jed and Silky Gibson? Will they now drop to lower than 8 and could be safe to use? The extremes are the ones that people are worried about.
Well, personally, I don't know I am putting a lot of effort not to know the bulls themselves to maintain my unbiasedness. Of course, I'm following 2 or 3 that I use as checking. So I don't know these bulls, but I can tell you right away that it's highly likely these bulls will be below 8 because the whole population, as John showed in his distribution, will be lower. And it's highly likely, however, if they are as extreme, that they will be much higher than the average of 2.2. So they're likely, if they are very extreme, they will likely be close to 5 or 6, which is something that is going to be unusual to see in the new evaluation. Other than that, I will leave the floor to Sophie, that she might be much more, well, she's certainly much more knowledgeable in the bulls distribution.
Well, I would say have a look at the table in our second communication, also the one that John just put on the slide, that gives you some examples of bulls. Now, we put this table in the communication. We wanted to give some examples of familiar names, but also we wanted to sort of show where particular bulls could fall. So we selected bulls on purpose that have a range. So for sire calving ease, they range from 6 to about 13 on the current scale, where 13 is pretty high. And Denver, with a PTA of 13, will go to a 4.3. This is a traditional value. Obviously, we can't say, with certainty what his genomic value will be in August, but you can sort of get an idea from this table where those bulls will fall. And I agree with Ezequiel, if the bull is extreme now, he will likely be on the upper end of the scale in August as well, but that PTA will accurately reflect the incidence rate that you can expect of the daughters. So that is something that you currently have a better indication of following August. Any follow-up questions, you can always, contact NAB directly or the bull owner AI company.
Yeah, Brad, I think the challenge is folks are going to have to recalibrate what they think of as extreme, right? Because right now, if you look at a bull like Juniper Rotate Jet, or for stillbirth, you look at some of the BW Marshall sons, you're used to seeing like double-digit sorts of PTAs. Now you're going to see much smaller numbers, and I think some of it is it's just going to take us all a while to recalibrate our internal meters, if you will.
Ezequiel, there's a question directed to you. Will the foreign bulls decrease or increase on the rank list due to the missing data?
Well, that's an easy answer. It depends. So there's not an easy answer actually. It depends on what traits are missing and what is the impact on the calvinability as well. So there are some bulls that increase highly and some bulls that decrease highly. I've been seeing the largest changes in, as I was saying, in terms of numbers in brown Swiss. There are some hosting animals, foreign animals, that change a bit as well, but most of that is on the brown Swiss, and they are up and down. The ones, of course, that pop in my eyes are the ones that go up pretty large, and I should focus probably in the ones that go down because those are the ones we will get questions for. But it depends. It really depends on the amount of information that is available for each of the animals. So there's not a straight answer, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ezequiel. We have two more questions that we have not yet answered. So kind of last chance to type in your questions into the chat, so we're sure to answer them all. One question: what was the correlation between the new and old PTAs for calving ease in Holstein? Can we say the change is only a scale effect?
So as for traditional evaluations, that's where at least the ones I made the statistics, the correlation was 99 point higher. So it was a really high correlation. For stillbirth, the correlations are a little bit lower because there is a new population in place, but it's still pretty high. I don't have the number off the top of my head right now.
I mean, right. So to answer the question is, yes, this is principally a scale effect. And in fact, the rank correlations should be 1 within traits.
Then a question from Stephen Miller. Your model is fitting sire birth year, I believe I saw. What effect or phenomenon did you observe that caused you to add this to the evaluation?
So I cannot speak for Stefano, but if I remember correctly, the reason for including the sire birth year is because the graph that I was showing in my presentation of that divergence of sex ratio, and that graph showed the year of birth, so essentially the sex ratio by year of birth of bulls. So what has been going on is that since the year 2000s, essentially, every year that ratio has been changing, and that's why parity, and also parity was one of those big variations, because that big gap between sex ratios was only observed in first lactation animals. In the second and third lactations, there was some slight variation, but definitely not as dramatic as in first lactation animals. So that was the reason why this interaction, and again, as I said in my presentation, sex was included already in the model, but apparently the way it was included was not picking up all that variation that happened in the last 15-20 years.
You might add that it reflects the introduction of sex semen. So conventional semen is used on the cows and sex semen is used primarily on the heifers. So that's a more recent trend the last 10 years. So that's why the sire by sex by parity was included into the model.
Right. In addition to that, there's also the availability of sex versus conventional on which varies between bulls, older bulls and younger bulls. So that is also captured in this effect.
And Ezequiel, Stefano confirmed your explanation as correct.
Okay, my memory is not that bad. Good.
Yeah. Well, I believe that we have answered all the questions posed in the chat. We will save that and we have that dialogue for any follow-up. I will give all of our panelists just a moment for any closing comments. First, I would like to alert you where you could go for more information. There were a few references today to some different articles, different links. My simplest advice to you would be if you go to the CDCB website under What's New and CDCB Connection. This morning, the July CDCB Connection was emailed out. You can reference that and it has links to all of the different materials, articles, and explanations that have been published. As well, you could go onto the CDCB website to the CDCB Connection, click on that July link if you are not on the mailing list. At that same section of the website, there's also directions how you could subscribe if you'd like to get on the monthly newsletter. So we're really appreciative to our media partners who are helping to spread the word and publishing articles June, July, and a few in August, just before the evaluations are published and the changes go into effect. With that, I would open the floor for each of our panelists just to give a few closing comments or takeaways. Ladies first, Sophie.
Wow, thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming on this call. I am very impressed with the variety of people that joined this call. So thank you for that. I guess my most important closing comment is that we have been very happy and excited and impressed with that this was a bottom-up approach, like Ezequiel said. So it was really a grassroots, boots on the ground, dairy producers talking to reps from breeding associations and from AI companies, and then those professionals passing it on to the many committees that are around the genetic evaluation system. And I'd like to encourage everybody to keep doing that. If you see things that just don't add up, everybody has a gut instinct about what happens on farm, or even if you're a dairy producer and you see things that you're like, that can't be right, please speak up and let us know, because currently I think we're proud of the collaborations that we have. We're acting fast, we're listening, and we want to keep doing that, because that's the way to keep the industry healthy and in the leading position that we are. So please continue to do that. And that's both in America and internationally, of course. And then secondly, I'd like to just have a bit of a shout out to the Brown Swiss enthusiasts and people out there. I know that we have mainly used Holstein examples, but obviously Calving is also a trait for Brown Swiss. So if there are any specific questions for those animals, please let us know as well. Know that we are here to assist you wherever possible. And then lastly, thank you, Amy, for setting us up. Thank you for doing a great communication around this topic, and CDCB and AGIL for doing all the crunching of the numbers. It was a great collaboration.
Thanks, Sophie. Tom, what are your takeaways for the day?
Well, the takeaway is that we have more accurate genetic evaluations, and the evaluations better reflect what's happening on the farm. So the first part we didn't really talk about too much, because that was implemented in April, but we need to thank University of North Carolina because they're the ones that were very much involved in changing the model. And the model needed to be changed to take into account the use of sex semen. And we can see that we have more accurate evaluations by the higher correlations that we see with our international partners. So the evaluations are more accurate. And then once they were introduced in April, we saw that we needed to change the scale to make them more reflective of what farmers are seeing within their own farms. So we're at a very good point where we have evaluations that are more accurate, more descriptive of what's actually happening. And it's been a good involvement by the entire industry. So this is a good moment for calving trait evaluations.
Thank you, Tom. John, any closing comments?
I'm going to continue to say the same thing I always say, which is please use the index, particularly now that the averages for these PTAs have been updated. Please don't put extra rules of thumb on top of the index. You break it and it doesn't work the way it should when you do that. And I would also like to just take a minute to thank some folks who haven't maybe been recognized today, who have been behind the scenes doing a lot of the work. You know, Paul Van Raden did a lot of the work on updating net merit. Gary Folk in our group and Jay McGonigal at CDCB have been doing a lot of work on the back end, on the computing front, getting programs updated and testing things. And you know, just I really appreciate the unified effort we had here between Holstein and NAAB and CDCB and AGIL to work together to make the system better.
This is Tom. I just realized that I made a mistake, so I want to correct it before I get yelled at too much. I complimented the University of North Carolina, and I should have complimented North Carolina State. My apologies.
Thanks, Tom. We know those interstate rivalries. We want to respect those. And Ezequiel, you started us off today. Would you bring it home and close our webinar?
Well, not much else to say. Actually, John stole my line here, my punchline. I was going to thank the people behind the scenes. Gary did a lot of work. Of course, Paul is always involved in any change, and he's so omnipresent that we typically don't mention him. And Jay McGonigal in the implementation, and Stefano that is still supporting the implementation of this. So with that and what Tom was saying about the genetic evaluation being much more sound now than before, which is a great news, especially for someone like me that needs to respond to the questions after the evaluation. So with this said, I think that we have a better system now. I think that it will take a while for people being able to adapt to the new numbers. That will create some raised eyebrows at the beginning. It's expected, but the full review that these evaluations have undergone with, and with the what Sophie was saying about industry collaboration, is not trivial thing. There was a lot of meetings and people expressing their concerns, and then having a saying on how the changes were going to be included, and that was great. It was a great example of industry collaboration giving an answer to a problem. Yeah, with that, I would close that with let's keep doing that.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone who has joined in. I see there was one final question that came in asking if this webinar has been recorded. It certainly was, and we will post it on the CDCB YouTube as well as the CDCB website in the next few days, so that you can review or pass that on to colleagues as you wish. So thanks so much for tuning in, and do stay in touch, and we'll continue to answer your questions as they're sent in to any of the contacts or the experts that you've heard today. Thank you, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.